ay, ay, ay. Good evening! How are you, my holy sisters and brothers? Of course, that was Zusha playing East Shtetl. How are you doing? I love that tune. I'm betting you love it too. Again, Zusha from their album. I think the album is called Kavana, and that song is East Shtetl. How are you? Let's light up the darkness. Who is gonna be with us on this fine Thursday evening? Very excited for Shabbos coming in tomorrow. Who's here tonight? Stephen Giger, I'm so glad you're here. It's your dedication that we'll be reading in a couple of minutes, and you are first tonight. Carol Chappell from Cleveland. And Steve, you know what, Stephen, I'm going to ask you, this dedication is going to be in honor of June Talisman. And is that in honor of, for the healing of, or in memory of? Let me know in the comments so that I can get that right. Okay, also Carol Chappell from Cleveland, Melissa from Great Neck, Yehudit from Florence, South Carolina, Nancy in North Carolina, Paula in Chicago, James in Indianapolis, Christo in Lubbock, Renee in Indianapolis, Stephen in Oklahoma, Jim in New Hampshire, Bill in Arkansas, Andy Bass says shalom, Randy, shalom from Florida, Carmen, Portland, Oregon in the hizzle, Jonel Nowie, we love you also, our loving Jewish, and I want to be part of the Jewish, and I love your religions. Thank you, Jonel, and welcome. You're here to learn with us, and we're so glad you're here. Tevi in Orlando. Andy is in Social Circle, Georgia. Marjorie's in Georgia. Sharon in New Jersey. Angie in Bexley. Hannah Rivka says Shabbat Shalom. Bridget in Dallas. Edward in Torrance, California. Thank you, Stephen. It's for Refuah Shlema. Carmen, can you make a dedication to healthcare workers? I'm happy to do that. But in terms of people who dedicate an episode of the show, it's because they make a donation, and then we read out that dedication, and it accrues to their merit and the merit of the one for whom it is dedicated. That the tzedakah, right, giving to our nonprofit, is a merit to the one who gives and to the one for whom it is given in honor of. Devorah Hannah is in Maitland in New South Wales, Australia. Wonderful that you're with us, Devorah. Must be almost Shabbos for you, right? And John says, Sedona in the house. Welcome, John. Over there on the YouTube side, Sheila in Montana, Neil in Virginia, and Lynn in North Texas. Welcome, everybody. So as I mentioned, Stephen Giger is dedicating tonight's show for a refuah shlema, a complete healing for June T. We don't like to read people's whole names when it's for a healing, but we know that it's for her, and you know that it's for her, and she should know that it's for her. May she have a complete and speedy recovery of whatever her ailment is, and we say amen. And Stephen, may you and all your loved ones be showered in blessings. Thank you for donating to our nonprofit and dedicating tonight's show, and we say amen. Also, Patrice, and I hope I'm pronouncing this right, Patrice Iatarola is dedicating tonight's show for the merit of Avraham ben Yosef ve'Esther. And so... Oh, I'm sorry. So the display name is for Racheli. So Racheli Iatarola must be making the dedication. May you and all your family be showered in blessings, and may the merit of our learning accrue to Avraham ben Yosef ve'Esther. And we say Amen. A couple of days ago, so it was Tuesday, that was June 5th, we celebrated 1 year of this class of AT Daily. And I intended to raise a glass and to make a l'chaim. And I forgot on that day, and yesterday things were so crazy in the nation that it seemed a little tone deaf to raise a glass yesterday. So let's raise a glass today. And we can make a l'chaim, we can make a bracha. So I'm going to say the blessing. Blessed are you, Lord our God, ruler of the universe, by whose word everything comes into being. I'll say that in Hebrew. We'll say amen. And then I'll make a l'chaim celebrating our learning. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shakol nihiyeh b'divaro. Amen. Lovely. That gets the spirit firing, as it were. Literally, get the spirit firing. Okay, so l'chaim to all of us that we are learning together. It's been a year and 2 days, and a good enough reason to celebrate. All right, where are we holding? This is Tractate Pesachim, the 4th volume of the Talmud, with the laws of Passover. We are on Daf Mem Zayin, page 47. We're in chapter 3, continuing our discussion of the 4th Mishnah in chapter 3. Our Mishnah raises a dilemma. The dilemma is somebody is baking matzah during the first day of Passover. So the first day of Passover and the last day, for that matter, are actually Yom Tovim. Right? It's an actual holiday. The intermediate days of Passover, we continue the restriction that we cannot eat leavened bread. We have that for the whole week, but we can work during the intermediate days of Passover. But the first day and the last day, and outside of Israel, the first 2 days and the last 2 days are an actual Yom Tov, a holiday, when no kind of work is permitted, just like on Shabbos, except for cooking. We can cook on Yom Tov, on a festival, for the needs of that day itself. We're going to be talking quite a bit more about that momentarily. But the dilemma of our Mishnah is, so somebody's making matzah, he's going to bake matzah, and they're going to make enough bread, this matzah bread. Matzah is unleavened bread, so they're going to make enough of it that challah is going to apply, meaning the requirement, there's a minimum amount, which is actually quite a bit, like about 5 pounds of flour. But when you're making that much matzah, there's a requirement to pull out challah, right? It's a piece of the dough that is going to be given, it's set aside, it's consecrated as a gift to a Kohen, to a priest. So the issue is that this dough became tamei, it became ritually impure. So even though we still have to pull out the challah, it's not going to be edible for the priest, because the priest could only eat it when it was a state of purity. We don't make the challah gift to priests anymore. This applies when the Holy Temple is standing in Jerusalem. So the situation would be, you're making all this matzah. It is on the first day of Passover. You're going to do it for that day. You need to pull out the challah. The dough is tamei, ritually impure, so it can't be given to the Kohen. It must nevertheless be set aside for the priest. And then it needs to be burned. It needs to be destroyed because nobody can eat it. It's for the priest. He can't eat it, so it just needs to be destroyed. It's a small piece of dough, but it needs to be burned up. The dilemma is it can't be burned during Yom Tov. It can't be burned during the holiday itself, because that's like cooking, but it's not cooking for the purposes of eating on the holiday. So we would have to wait until that first day of Passover ends. The problem is that dough, in the meantime, it's going to leaven, right? As we saw, once you make dough, you have 18 minutes before it's considered to be leavened. And then if you don't bake it by then, it's leavened bread, it's chametz. You can't a Jew is not permitted by Torah law to possess chametz, leavened bread, during the festival of Passover. So he would have come to transgress this prohibition on chametz. The problem is, if you burn it right now, you're transgressing the prohibition on cooking, not for the holiday, right? You'd be cooking, but not to eat it on the holiday. So this burning would be unnecessary for the holiday. So how do we handle this? We have a dispute between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yehoshua. Rabbi Eliezer says, above all, we want to avoid this chametz, being in the possession of a Jew. So what do? We just bake the matzah without separating the challah. After it's baked, then we separate the challah, and which we know is permitted, but in the first instance, in the first place, that's not the way that it should be done. It should be separated while it's still dough. However, since we have this concern about the dough becoming chametz, becoming leaven, because it's the first day of Passover, we bake it first, we bake the matzah, then we separate the part that's the challah for the priest. We put it aside, and after the first day ends, then we burn it when it's no longer the holiday itself, that first day holiday of Passover. Rabbi Yehoshua says, no, you just pull out the dough the ways, which is the better way, the optimal way to separate challah for the priest. In this case, you separate the dough. You're not going to burn it. You're not going to bake it because you're not making it for the purposes of eating it on the holiday. So it's going to leaven. But according to Rabbi Yehoshua, it doesn't matter that it's going to leaven. Why? Because it's not in the possession of the one who is baking it. It's set aside for the priest. Right? So it's not really his. He's not violating the Torah verse, which says, it shall not be seen, it shall not be found in your possession during the festival of matzahs. So then the Gemara went into its analysis of this Mishnah and says, well, what is it exactly that Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yehoshua disagree on? And as we talked about at the end of yesterday's class, it seems like what they disagree on is the benefit of discretion, meaning since this challah that you would be pulling aside, you can choose which priest you give it to. So you can choose, normally if it was not tamei, if it was not ritually impure, you would give it to a priest when the temple is standing, right? This is a situation as it existed 2,000 years ago. So the fact that you could choose which Kohen, which priest to give it to is valuable to you. And therefore, even though it's been consecrated, it's not yours anymore. It belongs to this priest that you're going to give it to. Since you can still choose which priest to give it to that in itself, the ability to choose which priest is considered to be a valuable commodity. It actually has monetary value. And therefore, according to Rabbi Eliezer, you would be possessing this dough that you're going to have sitting around, and it's going to leaven, it's going to become chametz. It would be in your possession, so you transgress that Torah verse. According to Rabbi Eliezer, the fact that you're going to pick which priest you're going to give it to does not have value. It's meaningless, and therefore you're not possessing something of value, and therefore, even though it becomes chametz, you don't come to violate that prohibition. Now, today we continue our discussion of this case because the Gemara then says, actually, no, that's not what they're disagreeing about. In fact, how do they dismiss it? And how do they dismiss it? I just want to make sure I see. And the Gemara rejects this suggestion. Right. So the way they dismiss it is to say, no, actually, everybody holds that the benefit of discretion, it's valuable. It's valuable to be able to choose which priest you're going to give it to, but it doesn't have monetary value. And therefore, this chametz that's going to be in your possession, all agree that it would not, since it has no value, that nobody is possessing it. Right? That nobody is possessing it. And so actually what they disagree on is a different principle. What is that principle? In Hebrew, hoyil. In English, or maybe that's Aramaic, I'm not even sure. It might be Aramaic. But in English, it's translated as since, S-I-N-C-E. What does it mean? The principle here, as it's applied, is that according to Rabbi Eliezer, who holds by hoyil, who holds by the principle of since, it's possible that after he sets it aside to give it to a priest, he could regret that he set aside that particular piece of dough. He could go to a sage and he could say, I regret setting that aside. I did it at the wrong time. And if I'd known what the consequence was going to be, I wouldn't have done it. That is how you get your vows nullified. You go to a sage, you tell him that if I had known what the consequence of my vow would have been, I never would have made that vow. And if you make that case in the proper way, then the sage can nullify your vow and you're no longer held by it. So says Rabbi Eliezer, since he could retract the consecration of that piece of dough that he set aside for the priest, he still has the ability to bring it back into his possession. Therefore, it hasn't really left his possession until he literally hands it to a priest. And that's why, if it became leaven while it's sitting in his kitchen waiting to be burned that night after that first day holiday ends, he would come to violate the prohibition on owning leavened bread during the festival of matzahs. And Rabbi Yehoshua does not hold by hoyil. He says we do not say since. In other words, once it's consecrated, it has no value, it's set aside for the priest. The person who made it in his kitchen doesn't own it. The fact that it's in his house, but it's not his chametz, so he's not violating that prohibition, right? So now that we've introduced this idea of hoyil, since, right, and the idea that somebody who might be guilty of a prohibition, we're going to say he's not guilty of violating that prohibition, because since he could do this or he could do that, hypothetically, there's an out, it's like an escape clause, and therefore he's not guilty of that transgression. And now we're going to get into an epic debate. I was listening to the daf taught by Cerulli Bornstein on all daf from the OU, and he's great, big energy. If you speak Hebrew quite well and a good dose of Aramaic, then I recommend listening to him. I miss a lot, but at least I've been through the whole Talmud and I'm teaching it now, so I can follow probably 70% of what he's saying. He's teaching in English, but he mixes in so much jargon, it's not easy. But his energy is wonderful. And as he said, now we get into an epic debate between Rabbah and Rav Hisda on, do we hold by hoyil? Do we apply this principle of, well, since he could have done like this and he could have done like that, therefore this law is not going to apply to him, or do we not use this principle? So the classic case that they debate, and the actual debate is elsewhere in the Talmud, and we'll eventually get to it, but now it's being referred to, and it's actually going to occupy that debate is going to occupy our whole daf and tomorrow's daf, with suitable digressions so that we can, the way the rabbis always do. But the classic case is like this. So somebody is cooking, right? Somebody's going to cook on Yom Tov. Could be the first day of Passover, could be Shavuos, could be the first day of Sukkot, could be any festival, could be Rosh Hashanah. Now he's going to cook on the festival, not for the festival, but rather for the weekday which follows the festival. Absolutely prohibited. That is definitely prohibited, and it's prohibited by Torah law. And so therefore, if you do that, if you cook on a festival, not for the needs of that festival, but rather planning to eat it after the festival, then you are liable to lashes, to get flogged. Okay? So as we always say, you don't really get flogged. The only way that you would actually get lashes, like actually get whipped, is if when you did this, somebody who knew the law said to you, if you do that, you're going to be liable to get lashes, and then you did it anyway. and then he came to a Beis Din, to a rabbinic court with two witnesses, and they both testified that you were warned, and then you did it right after you were warned, and two people saw it. Okay, so then maybe you would get whipped. But generally speaking, we're talking about, as a Talmudic analysis, is one liable to those lashes or not? Not morally speaking, should they be whipped? That's not the question. Simply, are they liable to the lashes or not? Okay, so one who cooks on Yom Tov for a weekday after Yom Tov is liable to get lashes. Right? Rabbah says no. Rabbah says no, he should not get flogged. He should not get whipped. Why? Because when he's cooking on Yom Tov, even though he's cooking more than he needs to eat on Yom Tov, and he might even be thinking that he's going to eat it after Yom Tov, after the holiday, when we're back to regular weekdays, since we can say that a bunch of guests might drop in unexpectedly, and then he would need to have food for them. And I got to say, like, this definitely, I get that, because, in our house, both when I was growing up, and thank God, Nina has the same philosophy. Like, you never know how many people are going to come to dinner. You never know how hungry the people are going to be. So, like, you're not going to only cook what you think, people are going to eat, like, one serving. And God forbid they're extra hungry and then, we don't have what to give them. Of course we make more food than we need, for that dinner itself. And so it kind of makes sense. So Rabbah says, since guests might drop in, and then he would need all the food, so then we can't say that he really cooked for the weekday after the Yom Tov, and therefore we don't whip him. And Rav Hisda says, what are you talking about? He cooked way more food than he needs for the holiday. He was cooking so that he would have food all week beyond the holiday. That is prohibited. He is liable to receive lashes. Hold on a second. So Rabbah says we hold by hoyil, this principle of since, we could say. And Rav Hisda says we don't hold by hoyil. We don't say that, since guests could drop in, therefore he's not guilty, he's not liable. He is liable. Rabbah is going to object to Rav Hisda. And Rabbah says, so according to you, that we don't say hoyil, how is it possible that the sages permitted that a person can cook on Yom Tov, can cook on a festival for the needs of Shabbos? So if, for example, there's a holiday that falls on Friday, and Friday's the day when we're normally cooking for Shabbos because we can't cook on Shabbos, right? For sure you can't cook on Shabbos. And you can't do any work, the 39 prohibited categories of labor that you can't do on Shabbos. All of them apply on Yom Tov, on a festival, except for cooking, right? So you can cook and do the things that are related to cooking on a holiday. Now, if that holiday falls on Friday, which is the day when we're normally preparing the food for Shabbos, can we cook during that festival, not for the needs of the festival, but for the needs of Shabbos, the very next day? Answer, yes. Yes, we can. So right there, we're cooking on the festival for something that we're going to eat after the festival. When? On the Shabbos, which follows the festival. So since we're permitted to do that, it must be, says Rabbah, that the sages do hold by hoyil. They must, the sort of, legal fiction that they must be using is, since guests could drop in on Friday more than are expected, therefore that's really what we're cooking for, and then we're going to end up eating it on Shabbos. Answers Rav Hisda, what are you talking about? That's not, it's not because we hold by hoyil, by this principle of since, in this case, that guests could drop by. That's not why we're allowed to cook on Friday for the needs of Shabbos. The reason we can cook on Friday for the needs of Shabbos is because the sages instituted a special procedure that we use when that situation arises, namely Erev Tavshilin, right? So this is a joining of the days for the purpose of cooking. What do? So on Thursday, we're going to be cooking for the festival, right? We're getting ready for that holiday meal that's going to be Thursday night when that festival begins. We're not going to wait until, it's already the festival. We're probably cooking on Thursday. When we're cooking on Thursday for this holiday that begins Thursday night, but it's really a Friday festival, what we're also going to do is we're going to recite this Erev Tavshilin recital, where it says that we are starting to cook now on Thursday for the meal that we're going to eat on Shabbos, right? Shabbos begins Friday night. So we're already starting that cooking. Now, we're not cooking the Friday night meal on Thursday morning. What we're doing is we're just setting aside like a piece of bread and something that we're cooking, very often a hard-boiled egg. And we're saying that this is the beginning of cooking the Shabbos dinner, and we've already started it before even the festival began. So then on Friday, when it's actually the festival, and we're cooking the Shabbos dinner that we're going to eat on Shabbos, but we're cooking it during the Friday festival, well, we already started that cooking process even before it was the festival. Now we're just continuing it. Because we recite that whole thing in order to be able to do this, we have a conspicuous marker, and this is going to protect people from coming to make the mistake that because they cooked on Friday for the needs of Saturday, and then they might think, oh, I can cook on a festival for what comes beyond the festival, and then they might come to violate that prohibition of cooking, let's say, on a Monday festival for a Tuesday lunch when it's not the festival. They're going to know not to do that, because in order to cook during the Friday festival for a Shabbos meal, they had to recite this Erev Tavshilin, the joining of the days, in order to be able to cook during the festival for Shabbos, right? So Rav Hisda is answering Rabbah. The fact that we cook on a festival for Shabbos in no way proves that we hold by this principle of since it could be. We don't hold by that. So Rabbah is going to try a different proof. He's going to say the case of the showbread will show that we do hold by this principle. How does that work? So I'll read it to you. Let me get my handy dandy book stand. Here we go. So the showbread in the temple. What was the showbread? So when the temple was standing, there was the altar where the sacrifices were brought. There was the menorah, the huge golden candelabra. There was the incense altar. And there was the table where the 12 loaves were located, called the showbreads. They were made of unleavened bread. We talked about them before. And one of the miracles of the temple, at least the first temple, is that they would be baked before Shabbos, right? And then on Shabbos, they would go in and they would replace the previous week's showbreads, and then they were going to sit on that table for 1 week. And the priests would take the previous week's showbreads off that table. And one of the miracles of the temple was that 1 week after sitting on this table, they would still be fresh and warm as if they just came out of the oven. And then this was one of the privileges of the Kohanim, the priests serving in the temple, that they got to eat from the showbreads when they were, the outgoing showbreads, when the new ones replaced them. So from the principle of the showbreads, Rabbah is going to raise an objection to Rav Hisda's claim that we don't hold by the principle of since. So the showbread may be eaten. So we have a teaching that the showbread may be eaten on the 9th, 10th, or 11th days from when it is baked. No less and no more. How so? In its usual manner, it is eaten on the 9th day after it was baked, as it is baked on Erev Shabbos. It says baked on Friday during the day. Right, so it's baked on Friday during the day. Where am I? And it is eaten on the next Shabbos, right? So it's baked on Friday. And then when does it get eaten? 9 days later on the following Shabbos, right? Because 1 week, 7 days later would be the next Thursday. The 8th day is Friday, and the 9th day is Saturday, the following Saturday. And that's when it gets eaten. If a festival occurs on Erev Shabbos, meaning on Friday, the showbread is not baked on the festival day, but rather on Thursday, Erev the festival, right? The day before the festival. Consequently, it is eaten on Shabbos of the next week on the 10th day when it was baked. If we have 2 festival days in a row, now we're used to that outside of Israel, that we double up 2 days of Shavuos, 2-day festival at the beginning of Passover, 2 days at the end of Passover, 2 days at the beginning of Sukkot, 2 days at the end of Sukkot. But in Israel, they're all 1-day festivals except for Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah, even in Israel, is a 2-day festival. Okay, so if the 2 festival days of Rosh Hashanah preceded Shabbos, then the showbread is baked on Wednesday, which is Erev Rosh Hashanah, and it is eaten on the next Shabbos, which is the 11th day from the day on which it was baked. And why? Because baking the showbread does not override not Shabbos and not the festival. So Rabbah asks, if you say that whatever one needs for Shabbos may be done on a festival, why doesn't the baking of this bread override the festival? Since the showbread is eaten on Shabbos, it should be considered food that one is permitted to prepare during the festival. Why do they prepare it before the festival? They should just prepare it on the festival. Rav Hisda said to him, they permitted one to override the rabbinic decree in the temple only with regard to baking on a festival for the immediate Shabbos, the proximate Shabbos, not for a Shabbos that's a week later, right? Since that bread is going to sit out there for a week in between when it's baked and when it finally gets eaten. So they don't override this prohibition on cooking during a festival for something that's going to be eaten after the festival. We allow that for Shabbos, but not for the Shabbos a week from now, just for a Shabbos that's immediately adjacent. So the needs of the temple here, it's a little bit different, right? Because that bread is going to sit out there on that table. That's a very unique case. That is not what's going on in people's homes when they're cooking on a festival for the Shabbos that is immediately afterward. So that, sort of what's going on there is Rabbah is saying to Rav Hisda, you say that we don't hold by this principle of since, but since must be involved. You said your proof was that when it comes to cooking on a festival for Shabbos, that's using Erev Tavshilin. I've showed you an example where it's not about an Erev Tavshilin, it's not a joining of the days, and they wouldn't cook on the festival. So maybe that discredits your view in general about baking on a festival for the needs after the festival, and therefore maybe you're wrong about whether we hold by this principle of since something could happen, therefore the law doesn't apply. You say we don't hold by that principle. I, Rabbah, say that it does. So then Rav Hisda says, well, let me show you a different case that's going to prove to you that we don't hold by this principle of hoyil, this principle of since it could be. So we're going to have two more cases like this. And both of them, I remember when I was a kid, we used to love to listen to George Carlin albums. And he was raised, I think, Catholic, right? I think Irish Catholic. And he talked about how, in his Catholic school, there was like, it was a comedy routine, but he was saying like you could do one thing and it could result in multiple sins. That's really all I remember from the bit. But that's actually a very Talmudic type of discussion, right? And so it's kind of like an exercise in the same way that a golfer, in order to become a good golfer on the golf course, spends a lot of time at the driving range, right? It's like kind of doing an exercise that prepares you to compete in the real game. So these are kind of like Talmudic exercises, right? So Rav Hisda is going to bring in this example, this case of where you do one action and it results in 8 sins, 8 transgressions, and then what he's going to show is if we did hold by this principle of since, of hoyil, it wouldn't be 8 sins, it would be 7 sins. And the fact that it's 8 sins should prove to Rabbah that he's wrong and we do not hold by this principle of since. So let's go. Rav Hisda, sent a question to Rabbah with Rav Acha bar Rav Huna. Right? So he sent a messenger, a young student as the messenger. And he says, do we really hold by this principle of hoyil, of since? Didn't we learn in a Mishna? There is a case where one plows one furrow, right? So like a farmer would plow a furrow in order to plant seeds, right? So he's going to plow and dig up the dirt, just one row in the farm field. He plows one furrow, and he's liable for violating eight prohibitions with this single act. The Mishna explains that this applies to one who plows with an ox and a donkey, thereby violating the prohibition, you shall not plow with an ox and a donkey together. 1, he plowed with an ox and a donkey. You can't do that. That's one of those chukim, one of those supra-rational laws. We don't understand why God said that. We don't do it because God said so. Okay, so that's a negative mitzvah, a prohibition in the Torah. So he plowed with an ox and a donkey together. And the ox and the donkey were consecrated, right? So the ox and the donkey were set aside to be given to the temple. The ox could be offered as an offering on the altar. The donkey could be consecrated for the needs of the temple. And there's certain other situations where you consecrate a donkey. So it's possible. So 1, you plowed with them together. 2, you used a consecrated donkey. 3, you used a consecrated ox. If his plowing aids the growth of food crops in a vineyard, he has transgressed another prohibition. Oh, he says, consecrate, I think they're only counting as 1. The fact that they were consecrated counts as 1. If the plowing aids the growth of food crops in a vineyard, he has transgressed a third prohibition. So the plowing, he's going to plant food in a vineyard. So that's violates the prohibition on kilayim, growing diverse kinds in a field together, right? So let's say he's planting wheat in the middle of a vineyard. That's prohibited. So that's 3 prohibitions. And he plowed during the sabbatical year, the Shemitah, right? So that means that in the 7th year, you need to let the land rest, right? So when the temple was standing and Israel was fully the Holy Land, ruled with a religious authority, then all the farmers, when it was a sabbatical year, would not plant crops during that year. So that's 4. And also, when the agricultural labor is prohibited, and he did this on a festival, that's 5. Additionally, the person plowing is a priest, and he's a Nazirite, a Nazir, and he's plowing in a place of ritual impurity, in other words, a burial site. So the place where he's plowing, it's known that a body was buried there, and no one knows exactly where in the field it was buried. So a Kohen cannot walk through that field. A Nazir can't come into contact with this source of tumah, this source of impurity. It is prohibited for a priest and a Nazir to become impure by walking over the burial spot of a corpse. Therefore, the one plowing commits 2 transgressions simply by walking across the field. Now, and that adds up to 8. So if we say the principle hoyil, since, if we hold by this principle of since, well, then he should not be liable for plowing on a festival. Why? Because the dirt that he is digging up, that he's loosening by plowing, is fit for covering the blood of a bird. What does that mean? It means that on a festival, you can shecht. Okay, so you can slaughter. I don't know why it's mentioning a bird. It could be just another animal that you could slaughter. You can slaughter on a festival, either to bring an offering, but really to cook, right? So if you had a bunch of guests coming, more than you expected, and you said, oh my God, we don't have enough meat for them, and they're all going to need to eat, so we're going to slaughter a lamb and cook it, right? We can cook on the festival for the needs of the festival. And if you don't have, an animal that was already slaughtered, you could slaughter the animal. If you slaughter an animal, so then, you can't eat the blood, right? So the Torah prohibits eating the blood. The blood gets poured out on the ground, but you shouldn't leave the blood sitting there on the ground because that's sort of like a disgrace for the animal that gave up its life so that you could eat it. So we cover the blood with dirt. So since he could say that guests might come by and he might need to slaughter an animal, and then he would need dirt to cover the blood. So the dirt that we've plowed up on a festival, that is not an aveira. That is not a transgression if you hold by this principle of hoyil, of since. Since the Mishna said there are 8 transgressions and not 7, therefore we know that plowing on the festival is counted as one of the 8 transgressions, and therefore it must be that the sages do not hold by this principle of since, we could say. This is Rav Hisda's proof that we don't hold by the principle of since. What is Rabbah going to answer Rav Hisda? Where am I? So how is Rabbah going to answer? So before Rabbah answers, Rav Papa Bar Shmuel is going to answer kind of on his behalf. And the case is one in which a person plowed sharp stones. Because he plowed up sharp stones, right, as a rocky field, so these stones that are plowed up, well, that would not be suitable for covering the blood of an animal that was slaughtered during the festival. So you don't really have that option. So this idea of, since we could say that the plowing would be to cover up the dirt, therefore we're going to excuse the plowing on the festival, and there's really only 7 transgressions, not 8. But it doesn't apply, says Rav Papa, because in this case it was a rocky field and you couldn't do that anyway. So we haven't ruled on, we haven't learned whether we hold by the principle of sins or not. And the Gemara challenges Rav Papa and says, well, wait a minute. Because Rav Papa, he called it sharp stones, but the Gemara translates that as not sharp stones, but clods of dirt, right? Like clumps, hard clumps of dirt. So the Gemara then answers, but wait a minute, these hard clumps of dirt, which are not fit to be used to cover the blood when you slaughter an animal, but you could crush these clumps of dirt, and then it would be dirt, and you could use it to cover the blood of the animal. And so our question is back in place. Doesn't this prove that the principle of since we do hold by it? Okay. And then the Gemara responds, is crushing permitted on the festival? Crushing is a forbidden labor. That's part of construction. We're not going to allow that on the festival. That shouldn't be allowed. And then the Gemara answers its own question. Yes, but if we needed those clods of dirt in order to cover the blood of an animal that we slaughtered on the festival, we could crush them in an irregular manner, not the usual manner. Therefore, we would all understand that really is for the needs of the festival. It's not regular crushing like we would do during the week on a construction site. So we're back where we were. This would seem to indicate that we don't hold by the principle of since there are 8 transgressions and not 7. So then the Gemara says, well, wait a minute. Is hard soil fit for planting? The case under discussion is one in which a person was preparing the ground in order to plant food crops in a vineyard. The Gemara answers, well, in this case, there was hard soil above and fertile, loose soil underneath, into which seeds could be planted. And the Gemara rejects this answer and says, derive that the act of plowing would be permitted in that case due to the loose soil, which is suitable for covering the blood. So again, we're back to Rav Hisda's proof is a good one. Since there's 8 transgressions and not 7, it seems that we don't hold by since. Rather, Mar Bar Rav Ashi said, the case is one in which a person plowed mud, and mud is not suitable for covering the blood. The Gemara asks rhetorically, and is mud suitable for planting? Why would he plow a field that's full of mud? He would never do that. And the Gemara answers, well, the case is one in which a person plowed moist earth, which is suitable for planting, but it cannot be used to cover the blood. So in that case, it seems like we're back to having 8 transgressions, and Rav Hisda seems to have prevailed over Rabbah. So Rav Hisda would let it rest right there. He says, I've proven to you that the sages, right, Rav Hisda and Rabbah, they're later sages, right? They're Amoraim of the Talmud. And Rav Hisda is saying the Tanaim of the sages of the Mishna, the earlier period, whose rulings are more authoritative than ours, they must not have held by this principle of hoyil. Abaye raises an objection to Rabbah's acceptance of the principle of hoyil, since, etc., using a similar type of exercise. And here it's where one person cooks a dish and becomes guilty of 5 sins, right? So that's the title of today's show. It's a wicked dish. You cook it once and you're guilty for 5 things. What are they? So one who cooks the sciatic nerve. So the sciatic nerve, that goes all the way back to when Jacob, our patriarch Jacob, wrestled with an angel all night prior to his encounter after 20 years of being away and now coming back together with his brother Esau, who he's very afraid of because 20 years ago he ran away because Esau wanted to kill him because Jacob got the blessing from their father Isaac in Esau's place. That night, so now it's 20 years later, he's going to meet Esau the next day. That night he wrestles with an angel, and that's where we get the name Israel, right? Jacob was renamed Israel. We are all the children of Israel. Why? He's the father of the 12 tribes of Israel, his 12 sons. And what am I saying? And so when Jacob wrestles with this angel, he's able to, out wrestle the angel. And the angel finally has to cheat, as it were, and he displaces the sciatic nerve in Jacob's hip. And then it says in the Torah, and to this day, the children of Israel do not eat the sciatic nerve of a cow, right? So it's kind of as a remembrance of when Jacob wrestled with an angel and basically prevailed, except that the angel cheated by injuring his sciatic nerve. Okay, so it's a Torah prohibition on eating the sciatic nerve of a cow. One who cooks the sciatic nerve in milk on a festival and eats it is flogged due to 5 distinct prohibitions. How so? He is flogged due to the prohibition of cooking the sciatic nerve on a festival, which is prohibited because the sciatic nerve is unfit for consumption, right? So first of all, and let's just finish the way it's written here. Because the sciatic nerve is unfit for consumption. So since you're not allowed to eat it, you're not allowed to be cooking it, right? Cooking for something that you're not allowed to eat is unnecessary cooking on a festival. So that's one prohibition. And he is flogged due to the prohibition of eating the sciatic nerve, which is prohibited to Jews. That's 2, which is explicitly prohibited by the Torah. And he is flogged due to the prohibition of cooking meat in milk. And he is flogged due to the prohibition of eating meat that was cooked in milk. Those are separate prohibitions. You're prohibited to cook milk and meat together, and you're prohibited to eat milk that was cooked in milk. And lastly, he is flogged due to the prohibition of kindling a fire unnecessarily on a festival. One thing is cooking, the other one is kindling a fire. Those are separate prohibitions. And if we held by this principle of hoyil, of since, then we could say he should not be liable for kindling a fire unnecessarily, since the fire is fit for use in attending to his legitimate festival needs, i.e., cooking permitted foods. We could say that, that fire, actually, he's going to use it to cook later because maybe more guests are going to come and he's going to cook additional food. Since he could be using that fire, which is prohibited to cook, this prohibited mixture of the sciatic nerve of a cow cooked in milk, that it's prohibited to make a fire on a festival for that. But since he could use the same fire to cook something that is permitted, then we should say that at least that 5th prohibition, that 5th violation is not a violation. So he should, if we hold by the principle of hoyil, of since, he should only be guilty of 4 violations and not 5. This is Abaye's proof when he's challenging Rabbah and saying, we don't hold by the principle of hoyil the way you say. Rabbah answers Abaye and says, remove the prohibition of kindling a fire from the list and add the prohibition of eating a sciatic nerve from an animal carcass that was not properly slaughtered. Excuse me. So now Rabbah is rewriting the Mishna, and he's saying, there's 5 prohibitions, but it's not, but the 5th isn't because he kindled a fire for cooking. I agree with you. When he kindles a fire for cooking on a festival, okay, he can't kindle it for this food, but he could kindle it, as I say, since he could say, which Rabbah holds by, he might have used that same fire for permitted cooking. So really the reason there's 5 violations is because that sciatic nerve was not pulled from a cow that was slaughtered in a kosher manner. Rather, it's a cow that died some other way. It was shot with a gun, which is not a valid slaughter, or it died of some kind of disease, it fell off a cliff, who knows? It was not slaughtered in a kosher way. That's called a nevela. A Jew is not allowed to eat meat, even from a kosher animal, if it was not slaughtered in a kosher way. Abaye responds to Rabbah, and he says, didn't Rabbi Hia teach with regard to this Mishnah, he is flogged twice for his eating and 3 times for his cooking, right? Twice for the eating, as he violated the prohibitions of eating the sciatic nerve and eating meat cooked in milk, and 3 times for his cooking, as he violated the prohibitions of kindling a fire, cooking on a festival, and cooking meat and milk. And if it is so That the problem here, the reason there's 5 violations is because that sciatic nerve was pulled from a cow that wasn't shechted properly. It came from a nevela. Then in that case, it should have said that he's being flogged 3 times for violations related to eating and only twice for violations related to cooking. So then Rabbah says, okay, you're right. So I'm going to change my objection to your objection. So Rabbah says, remove the prohibition of kindling a fire and add in its place the prohibition of using wood that has been set aside from use on a festival. Now I'm almost done, so if you have questions or comments, get them in there now. So now Rabbah is saying, no, the violation for which he's going to be flogged, the 5th violation, isn't that he lit a fire in order to cook this prohibited mixture, because I say since he could use that fire for a permitted mixture, he's not going to be flogged for this because he lit that fire. Rather, the problem is that the wood he used to create this fire is wood that was not prepared for use on the festival. Rather, nobody had in mind that we were going to use that wood for cooking on this festival, and therefore, just like we have in the principle things that we can't touch things on Shabbos that weren't prepared for use on Shabbos. If they weren't prepared for use, they're considered set aside, muktzah. And as we discussed many times during our journey through the 2nd volume of the Talmud, Tractate Shabbos, muktzah is a principle that something that's not prepared for use on Shabbos or a festival is something that we don't touch at all. So it must be that wood was set aside, it was muktzah, and therefore it was not available for him to make a fire out of, but he did make a fire out of, so he violated the principle of muktzah. What's Abaye going to say to that? You might already be thinking, we talked about muktzah a lot of times in Tractate Shabbos, and what do we say about it? We said it's a rabbinic decree. It's a rabbinic decree that we're not allowed to touch that. So if you violate a rabbinic decree, you've done something that's prohibited, but you're not liable to get flogged for it, right? You're exempt. You violate a prohibition, but you're exempt from getting whipped. If you're liable to get whipped, it must be that it's a Torah prohibition. Says Abaye, and is muktzah a Torah prohibition? Haven't we learned that it's a rabbinic prohibition? And Rabbah says, no, I say that it is a Torah prohibition. And from where do we learn that muktzah is actually a Torah prohibition if we touch something that's if we use something that's muktzah for a festival in this case? We get it from the verse in Exodus 16:5 regarding the manna when the children of Israel were wandering in the desert. And it says, and it shall come to pass on the 6th day that they shall prepare that which they bring in. This word prepare teaches that we prepare for Shabbos and by extension festivals, so that we have in mind the things that we're going to use on Shabbos or on the festival. And if we don't have them in mind, they're not prepared, that means they're set aside from use. They are muktzah, and there's a Torah basis for that. And therefore, this verse teaches that anything that has not been prepared before the festival is considered to be set aside, and it is prohibited to utilize it. This verse indicates that utilizing set-aside objects is prohibited. However, it does not formulate this prohibition as a negative commandment. Therefore, the Gemara adds that the warning indicating that it is a negative commandment is from here. Exodus 20, verse 9, you shall not perform any labor. This general statement pertaining to Shabbos includes utilizing objects that were not set aside from before Shabbos. So that is where we're going to leave our cliffhanger, as it were, because what's going to happen is that, they're going to keep trying to prove to Rabbah that we don't hold by we don't hold by hoyil, that's principle of sins. But right now, in order to prove that Abaye's challenge to Rabbah is a valid challenge, they're going to have to do away with this idea of Rabbah that muktzah is a Torah prohibition. They're going to argue that for a while, and once they establish that muktzah probably is a rabbinic prohibition, not a Torah prohibition, then that's going to reinstate Abaye's proof that we don't hold by the principle of sins, And then we'll go to a few other places and examples as Rabbah and Rav Hisda continue their epic debate of, do we hold by hoyil the principle of, since it could be said, therefore this law has not been violated. Okay, let us check comments and questions. Sharon Frant-Brooks. Why is this sequence of activities sounding strangely like a variation of Chad Gad Yah? It does, right? So Chad Gad Yah is a song that we sing at Passover. And maybe the fact is, that when one is preparing for Passover, one starts studying the laws of Passover 30 days before Passover. So, like devout, pious, learned guys and women who are preparing for Passover might read Tractate Pesachim and come into contact with all of this and be thinking about this song, Chad Gad Yah, what is it that, I had a goat that my father bought for 2 zuzim, but it got slaughtered by the butcher, but the butcher, I can't even remember the whole song, but it got chased by a stick, that got chased by a fire, that got put out by the water, that got drunk by the ox, that got slaughtered by the angel of death, etc. It's one of those funny songs that has a whole bunch of stages. So good note. With regard to Jacob wrestling the angel, Bill Eldridge said, bah, cheating? What do you mean cheating? It was a real fight, not an exhibition match. Jacob should have known that there are no holds barred when you get into a brawl with an angel. Very good, Bill. What was I thinking? The fact is, it's incredible, right? And there's a lot of discussion that we could have on another day. With God's help, I have in mind that if we somehow get so much help from God that we are able to complete our journey through the Talmud, we have 6.5 years to go, having just completed 1 year. We have 6.5 years to go. So if we're all together and still learning in 6.5 years, and we make a siyum on the Talmud, then what I would like to do is maybe teach the whole Bible, right? And do maybe like 1 chapter a day. And I think if you do that, it takes like 3 years to do the Bible, because I believe there's 929 chapters in the Hebrew Bible. But at any rate, there's a lot to be said about Jacob wrestling with the angel, like what was really going on there. It's like this, like bizarre and truly epic, battle where like earth and heaven are coming together in one place. How could a human wrestle with an angel? It doesn't make sense. And yet somehow Jacob brought not just his muscles, but a tremendous spiritual force to bear in that battle. And, our sages have had a lot to say about that moment, but that's a conversation for another day. Sharon says, it actually never says in the text that it was an angel. Very good. It says that it was a man, an ish. The Hebrew calls him an ish, which means a man, and there are many instances of a mysterious ish who figures in Tanakh, in the Hebrew Bible. Exactly. The one that's always puzzled me, right, is when Joseph goes to look for his brothers, and this is when they sell him into slavery and how the Jewish people end up enslaved in Egypt many years later. But the Bible, which is so terse, right, the Torah is so terse, so minimal in the information that it uses to convey its stories, telling, big epic stories in just a few verses. And yet it adds, these like 3 extra sentences that, like, what do they accomplish in the story, right? Jacob sends Joseph to check on his brothers. And where does he go? He goes to Shechem, where he thought they were. And then there's a man there who says, oh, your brothers moved on and they're in this other town. I think it's called Dosan. And then he goes and finds them there. So what was the purpose of that episode? Just that he got directions, to go from one town to another town? But if the Bible includes it, as we've seen, the sages, just the fact that there's one letter additional in a word that doesn't need to be there, that can invite all kinds of interpretation and even legal rulings. 3 whole sentences. Why is it there? God had an important spiritual message by including that there. And again, we could get into a whole hour-long conversation about that. Oh, and Zach Plotzker has a question. For those who don't know, Zach Plotzker was the fellow at the mitzvah store the day that I happened to buy book 1 of the Talmud when it was day 1 of the 7.5-year Daf Yomi cycle. And, and as a result of what happened that day, and that I then committed to complete Daf Yomi and studied for 7.5 years from 2005 to 2012. And that's how I became the accidental Talmudist and started this platform. And, over the next 7 years, 1 million followers came in, and Nina and I do this every day in a nonprofit and this daily class, and all the learning of thousands and millions of people are happening. Why? Because when I took the book to the counter, Zach Plotzker didn't just ring it up, but rather Zach Plotzker said, you're doing Daf Yomi. To which I said, what's Daf Yomi? And if he hadn't said, you're doing Daf Yomi, and I hadn't said, what's Daf Yomi? And then he told me what it was, and then I realized that it was a big coincidence that I was buying book 1 of the Talmud on day 1 of a 7.5-year cycle. So it's amazing. It's amazing because we just said that what's the purpose of Joseph going to Shechem for a man just to tell him your brothers have moved on? But if that man wasn't there, Joseph would have gone home and his brothers wouldn't have sold him into slavery. And we would have spent 210 years enslaved in Egypt, and the Lord would have then redeemed us out of there with a strong hand and an outstretched arm, and then we wouldn't be celebrating Passover and studying the laws of Passover 3,000 years later. So, Zach Plotzker is like the man in Shechem. Shkoyach, Zach. Okay, my friends, that is what I've got for us this evening. It's been fantastic to learn with you with God's help. We have another page to cover, page 48, tomorrow on Friday. Of course, the normal time on Fridays is noon Pacific, and I look forward to seeing you then.